Good morning. Let's go ahead and get started if we could. You can turn in your Bibles to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3 is where we'll pick up this morning. I want to read this chapter as we get started, and then Steve's going to lead us in prayer. Then we'll back up and do a little bit of a review and look back on what we've seen in the first two chapters this morning. So as we pick up in chapter 3, Paul has in the second half of chapter 2 made the case that the Jews aren't in a better position because of having the law, and explained then that got into a discussion on those who are observing some of it but not all of it, and how that compares to those who maybe don't observe some of the ceremonial pieces but are doing what the law instructs. But in the larger context in that section, he's raised this question of the fact that the law doesn't have power to salvation, and made that point. And so in chapter 3, we pick up as he continues on in that thought. And he says here in verse 1, "Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though every one were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying? Their condemnation is just. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one who is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one, who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. Steve, please.
Let's pray together, please. Dear God, our gracious Father, what a blessing to call you Father. What a blessing to be here together. Thank you for your word, which you preserved for us. And as Andrew has just read and reminded us that there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. That we have all gone out of the way and we have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. We recognize that we ourselves are unprofitable, but your righteousness, apart from the law, was revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even your righteousness, which is through faith in Jesus Christ, to all of us, both Jew and Greek and all of mankind. We realize that we have all sinned and fall short of your glory. Help us to see more intently, more gratefully, more humbly, that we are justified freely by your grace through the redemption that is possible through Jesus Christ. Bless us as we continue our study together. Help us to be humble. Help us to reach out. Help us to be merciful, realizing that none of us are profitable except through your righteousness and through the faith that we have. Strengthen our faith. Bless Andrew and Kevin as they continue to lead us through our studies. Bless our time together today. May it be to all of our benefit and to your glory. In Jesus we pray. Amen.
All right, thanks, Steve. So as we mentioned several times already in this study, as Paul works through these explanations and arguments, it can be easy to get lost a little bit as he goes into a lot of depth about where he's at, where he's going. So we're going to constantly come back and look at the kind of the big overstructure that he's got around this and come back to that. So as we think just high level, highlighted on the screen here where we are in this kind of opening section, after Paul's explained his purpose in the first few verses, we're in this section where he's identifying the problem that the gospel solves, which is this need for grace. And so Paul started at the beginning of chapter 1 with this explanation of his role, as you remember, and don't have all the details that we fleshed out on this, but his overarching explanation, seeing ultimately that he was set apart for the gospel concerning the Son, through whom he receives and we receive grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith. And he declares that at the opening as his identification and his work and his role. And we saw then later in that chapter where as he goes back to the idea of the gospel, he says there in verse 15 that he's eager to preach the gospel in Rome. He's eager to strengthen them. And then he comes back to this gospel and says it's the power of God. It's the power of God for salvation, for Jews and Greeks, so for all have need of it. And that this gospel, this power of God, is what reveals God's righteousness, reveals the righteousness of God. And ultimately then, the righteous are going to be living by faith in this God. And so he then connects this idea of the righteous living by faith at the end of this section in chapter 1, at least in as we back up, we can see that he's connecting that back to the idea of obedience of faith, and an idea that he's going to come back to frequently in this text. So he's eager, he's wanting to proclaim this gospel. They're a strong church. He knows that they've got a lot of things going well, but he wants to strengthen them, and he wants to come back to the power of God, the gospel and the message, and reinforce that amongst them. And so what we see here from this opening statement is both a summary and a looking forward. All need the gospel. He's made that point in this opening statement. All need the gospel, and now he's going to show that. And so this opening section that we're working through then is to make that point. All have need for the gospel. If the gospel is the power of God for salvation, then who doesn't need the gospel? Those who don't need salvation. But he's going to make the point that all have need for salvation, and so all need the gospel. And so in the last half of chapter 1 and then into chapter 2, as we looked at in the last week, we're looking at this life without the gospel, where all are condemned. And so in the second half of chapter 1, he starts by focusing on one group, and he's going to go through a few groups here, but as he starts focusing on one group in the second half of chapter 1, who does he start with there? What people? What characterizes them? People of the world? Okay, and how are they defined in this? What is it that they've consciously done? They've suppressed the truth. They've not honored God. They didn't give thanks. They knew God, right? They weren't without excuse for knowing God. It's not like they could claim no one told us, because he says God's invisible attributes, his power, his eternality is known just in his work in creation. So it's not that they're without witness to God. It's not that they're without something to point them to God, but instead of honoring him as their creator, they've instead switched for these things that God created and given worship and thanks to those things. And so the kind of initial mistake they've made is they're giving worship to the things that were created rather than the creator. They're then turning and giving approval to unrighteous conduct. And note that we probably didn't put enough emphasis on that when we talked about that a week ago Wednesday. But as he explains their unrighteous conduct in that section, in the second half of chapter 1, what he says there towards the end of chapter 1 is really one of the key things. In verse 32, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So it's not just what they're doing with this group, but it's the fact that they're giving approval to these things that they know are against what is good and what is right. And so the ultimate outcome for them, as you see on the screen and see in the text, is what? What outcome has God given them to? What's that? Yeah, he's given them up to the outcome of what they want. They pursue these things, and God's not going to try and restrain them from where that leads. He's going to give them up, and they're going to play this out, their immorality, all the things that they get caught up in righteousness. He's given them up to the outcome of that. And then in chapter 2, he moves on to another group. In the first part of chapter 2, who's he focused on now? People who are doing what? They're teachers, and what are they doing in their teaching? They're judging, they're condemning. So this group isn't like the first group that gives approval to unrighteousness. This group condemns it, right? They judge it there in the first part of chapter 2. They're condemning this conduct, but what are they doing? Many of the same things, right? They may not approve it like the first group, but they're actually living it. They're conducting it. Maybe not always and all things, but they themselves are doing these things that they condemn. And so what does God say they're doing about their outcome or their future? They're storing up what? They're storing up wrath. They're storing up wrath for themselves on the day of God's judgment when his wrath will be revealed. So this group is not like the first group. Maybe they're even condemning the first group. Don't know if that's intentional or not, but it may very well be the case that this group says, well, at least I'm not like them. You know, I don't approve of these things. I point out that they're wrong, yet they still walk and do many of the same things. And God says that group is storing up wrath for themselves on the day of judgment. But then there's a third group here in chapter 2, and this is what we focused on Wednesday night in particular. Who's the third group? And we'll come back to whether this is the same group or not, but who's the third, at least clearer point of focus in the second half of chapter 2? The Jews, yeah. These are people who have the law, and they're out there, and he makes a point that they are explicitly professing the law. They're boasting on the fact that they have on the law. They rely on the law. If you look in verse 17 and following, you know, they're doing all these things. And so they're putting an emphasis on the law, but their obedience is incomplete. They're hanging on to parts of the law like circumcision, but yet like the middle group there, they're still doing many of the things that they shouldn't do. So in effect, they've shown themselves to be lawbreakers because they're teaching and professing this as the law, but yet they're breaking the very thing that they're teaching and professing. And so God makes the point in that section that they're going to be judged by the very law that they proclaim. Rather than that law and their partial observance of them vindicating and justifying them, they're going to be judged by the very law that they proclaim. And so as we've said already, there's a little bit of a question as to whether or not the second and the third group are the same, whether that whole chapter is about Jews or whether the first half of that is not intended to be viewed solely as Jews. But in any case, you kind of see the progression here, right, that Paul's making, starting with those who just completely disregard God and approve what is ungodly and unrighteous, to those who are, on appearances at least, professing things that are right and saying things that are right, but their obedience is still incomplete. And so their condition, their position, their outcome is the same. As you look across all three of those boxes at the bottom, they're all subject to condemnation and judgment. Even though what they say and what they teach is different, they're all subject to condemnation. And so as you think about the point of this opening section, Paul could stop right there and have his point made, that all of these groups are condemned by what they're doing or in some cases not doing. Jason? Right. Exactly. Yeah. If you couldn't hear that, Jason's saying he starts with people who, though they had not the law, were accountable because they should have known God in his eternal attributes, and then ends this section talking about people who have not the law even after the law was given, yet still are doing many of the things that the law teaches. Other things that you want to draw out through these first couple of chapters by way of review or question? Okay, so with that in mind, like we said, he could just stop right there and his point is made, right? As you go back to the structure and how this argument is progressing, he's made the point that all have need of salvation. All are condemned by what they're doing and saying, and so all have need of salvation. But Paul, as he often does, doesn't just stop there, because he knows that even though he said these things, people are going to raise questions about this. People are going to raise maybe objections to some of these things. And so what we see then in chapter 3 is him going to continue this argument just a little bit further to acknowledge some of these points of objection or question that are raised here. And so as we look at the first 20 verses of this chapter, which is going to be our focus this morning, what we see here is this high-level structure, not all the details of it, but just high level, appreciating what he's doing here. He's made his argument, he's made his point that all are condemned. And he's going to begin the chapter by acknowledging a question that may be raised, and he's going to give his response. And then he's going to anticipate that his response is followed by an objection. And he's going to address that and then come back to a second question with another response. But the conclusion of that is still going to be the same. And in fact, the conclusion of that is going to further underscore this point that all are condemned under sin. All are condemned under sin by what they say and what they teach and what they've done. So let's dig into chapter 3 now and start to work through these questions that he has here. Let's read again the first 8 verses of chapter 3. After, again, he's made the point now that even those who have the law, even the Jews, are condemned by their partial obedience and incomplete obedience to the law, he then says, acknowledging this question, then what advantage has the Jew? What's the benefit of being a Jew, of having the law? What is the value of circumcision? Why did God do this? He says, much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means, for then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying? their condemnation is just. So his question is what? You're thinking about the logic of what he's just said. If the Jews are condemned, which was, again, that point in the second half of chapter 2, if the Jews are condemned, what benefit is there to the Jews? And I think we can see, perhaps by implication of that, particularly when he makes the comment about circumcision, what benefit is there to the law or to having the law? So this is the question that he raises, knowing that if even the Jews are condemned, he recognizes someone asked, well, then what was the benefit? What was the point of this? Is there a benefit? What's his response? So you look there in verse 2. John?
That they were entrusted with God's word. That was the benefit. What gets me is he says, first of all, this is the first example, but he never gives a second example.
Yeah, he suggests perhaps some sequence here, but one's enough for his response, right? And so, much in every way, and you're going to see these emphatic statements that Paul makes, and just appreciate them. It's not that the initial statements themselves carry a lot of weight, but just to make the point, like, hey, even when you ask this question, you're missing something, right? You're missing something big here. You're missing the point. And so much in every way, it's not just that there's some obscure little benefit to having the law or to being a Jew. Like, this was still a significant thing. And so he says the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God in the ESV. The Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Think about that word entrusted first. I think we understand what the word means. There's no hidden meaning in the Greek or something like that we're trying to draw out. It means to believe or to trust in. But it's got the same root as the word that we most often see, faith. The word pistis is what we see for faith. This idea of entrusting is the same root, so it comes from the same idea, and that's what we see him playing on then in the rest of his explanation. God trusted the Jews. God put faith in those to whom he gave the law. We think about our faithfulness in God, our faithfulness to God, and he's making the point that God put faith in the people to whom he gave the law. And it wasn't just the law that he gave here. What word does he use in this text? You see there, oracles. And what's the difference between oracle and law? On the surface, we may use those interchangeably, but any idea on what the difference between those is, at least from a scriptural usage of the point of the word for oracle here? Exactly. It's the spoken word, the spoken direction. These are divine words, is how we might otherwise translate the word oracles. So his point, even though there's so much reference to the law, he's not characterizing it just as code here. This word emphasizes the origin. The Jews, those who received this law, were actually, God was putting faith in them with divine words. Words of divine origin. So it's not emphasizing, or it's not exclusive of this, but at least not emphasizing the code aspect of this or the regulatory aspect of those words, but the origin of them. So they were entrusted, he had faith in them with these divine words. And so, on the surface, right, we just understand his response as he's trying to show that this was an honor, but I want to just pause there. What, by implication, is the honor and the significance of this? John?
We too are entrusted
Okay.
with the word of God, just as the Jews were.
Okay, so there's an important point for us as we spell this out to think about what it means to be entrusted and why this was a good thing. Stephen?
That would have given them the opportunity to know God differently than the rest of the world, to know his characteristics, to know his plan, to know him, which we know is of great significance.
Exactly. The Jews were given the opportunity for a special covenant. By God choosing to have faith in them to give these divine words, he has chosen them for a special covenant, a special relationship, not to the exclusion of others, but a special relationship with him, a special role in his purpose in bringing about salvation for all and blessing all the peoples of the earth. And so Stephen used the word opportunity. It was a tremendous opportunity, but also an opportunity that came with responsibility, right? And how we look at this, how we look at these ideas of privilege is what's key to this. You think about in a workplace setting, there are some people, if you're in a large organization and they get a title, and when they get that title, they feel entitled, right? They just go about, I'm in charge, I get to make the rules, I get to make the directions, right? And so, look at me, I've been given this title, and you can see leaders who that's their mindset, they're entitled by their title. But then other people who are given a title or a role of high authority or management, how do they view things differently? Connecting back to this thought. Steve? Yeah. How can I be responsible with this opportunity and privilege to help others, to help the organization, to lead people along, Scott?
I think being entrusted with something like a mail carrier, they are entrusted with a piece of mail that's very important for somebody to read stuff. I think about it a lot.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Scott, if you didn't hear him, talked about the idea of a mail carrier, someone who you put trust in to deliver this important information, this important document to people who need that. And so the role of the Jews was still one of benefit, one of good position, not that it made them different from other people in terms of their status before God or in terms of their position as it relates to salvation, but they had this tremendous opportunity and privilege to be a light to the world. That's what God intended them to be, right? This holy nation, this kingdom of priests, to be a light to the world, to take what he gave them as instructions and show the rest of the world those instructions through the way that they lived and they conducted themselves as a holy nation. That was what they were given the opportunity to do, but instead, they viewed this as an entitlement, as we see him explain along here. And so to John's point at the beginning, as we think about the idea of being entrusted, think about what it means in the context of the Jews as well. So they've got this honor, they've been entrusted with the oracles of God, but he points out it was the Jews who weren't faithful. John?
They also assumed that because they were people of God and they were given the law, that they were automatically saved.
Right.
There wasn't anything that they needed to do.
Yeah, they made assumptions in that process, right, that were incorrect. And so he points out, having been given this honor of being entrusted with the divine words of the oracles of God, it's the Jews who weren't faithful, not God. It's the Jews who, though God put faith in them, he entrusted them, they weren't faithful, but God remains faithful throughout that. In verse 3, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. And so what he's using there in verse 4 is a quotation from Psalms 51. And for sake of time, we won't go back and read that. But if you haven't, just go back and read even just the first few verses of Psalms 51 there, because this quotation is early in that. And as we recognize this psalm, David's writing this after realizing his own sin with Bathsheba and all the things that came from that. And he's been pointed out the error that he's made. And what's David's point when he's making this statement that Paul's picking up here? How has God been faithful? David's being punished, right? David's suffering consequences, significant consequences for his sins. But how does it demonstrate God's faithfulness? Yeah, he's following through with his promise, right? He's following through with his words. He's someone who speaks, and you can rely on the things that he says. You don't have to question whether these things are actually true or not. So God was faithful, and so even David recognizes here in his own sin that what God is doing is showing himself to be justified, to be faithful in his own words, because he's following through with the punishment, with a punishment for the error that David made. And so you see that point being made in Paul's actually going to use this in 2 Timothy. Again, another reference that we won't go to for sake of time, but you look at 2 Timothy 2, he brings that same idea forward in that text to Timothy, where he has this saying that if we are faithful to God, we will live and reign with him. But if we are faithless, God will still be faithful, and he will deny us just as we have denied him, because he can't be anything less than faithful to his words, to his oracles, to his divine spoken words. He can't be less than anything faithful to the things that he has taught and said. And so this example of the mistakes of the Jews and things that they've done actually serves to highlight that God's words are trustworthy. God can be trusted for what he has said. Let me pause there. Are there things that you want to draw out from these first few verses here? Okay, so then in verse 5, he picks up with the objection now. So he's shown, okay, God's demonstrating faithfulness even when he judges people for their unfaithfulness. God's demonstrating faithfulness. But wait, he says. And so he's using this human logic. He's saying this isn't, rational reasoning. I'm using human logic here. And he's going to this point. If God's condemning men for their unrighteousness, and he's made the point that all are unrighteous and all are condemned. And so if God's condemning men for unrighteousness, it actually highlights God, actually highlights his righteousness, actually draws attention to his righteousness. We might say that this makes God look good. If condemning the unrighteousness of people makes God look good, isn't God then acting unrighteously by condemning them? He's taking advantage. You might say he's taking advantage of this situation and trying to get some benefit from man's failures. Now, Paul has made it clear that this is man's wisdom. There's no rational scriptural reason for that. He's saying this would be man's objection. And what's his answer to that? Is this true? Is this the case? Is God unrighteously taking advantage of the situation, of the unrighteousness of men? What's he say? Certainly not. Again, another strong, emphatic statement. By no means in the ESV is this true. And so he's acknowledging this argument to make it clear this was not the point that he was trying to make. God's not here just to show his own righteousness in condemning all these groups of people that we've talked about in the first couple of chapters. This was not Paul's point. And as he goes on, he doesn't try to put together a long, lengthy explanation to that objection, but he makes 2 points in the form of rhetorical questions. What's his first one here? Yeah, how could God judge the world? And it seems like he's building on the understanding that would hopefully be common, that God is going to judge the world. He's going to judge all men, and he's going to make a distinction. Well, if God's just out here to condemn unrighteousness of men, to make himself look good, how's he going to judge the world in the end? Right? If that's what he's doing, how's he going to judge the world at the end of time? And so again, he doesn't go into a full explanation of it. He offers it as in a way, a rhetorical question. And then he follows that up with another kind of question or statement that if this is true, what might as well we be saying or teaching? Then let's just do evil, that good may come. If God is getting some benefit, if he's getting some good out of the unrighteousness of men, why don't we just start teaching that people should do evil so that God can be good? And again, he's not going into a lengthy explanation here. He's just asking rhetorically, like, doesn't this even defy sensible logic? Now, he's going to come back to this in chapter 6, so it's not like he's going to leave this hanging, right? He's going to come back to this in chapter 6 and actually give a fuller answer, but for now, he's content to just ask these questions as a response to that. Bill? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's not going to leave us hanging, right? He's not going to throw these questions and not really explain them. But for now, he's trying to point out that even on the surface of what you say, that this way of thinking, this way of teaching is condemnable. And he's going to come back to that later in his document. Other things you want to draw from those few verses? Steve? Yeah, it's a great point. You see this example here, and we can get so hung up, we can, get focused on one specific issue or one specific teaching, sometimes one specific phrase in a verse. Well, here's exactly what that means, right? And not see where the rest of that thinking goes and leads. And does that connect with other things that we see in Scripture? Is it consistent with other things that we read? One of the things that, for me, even at a very macro level, like when the question comes up of does God exist, come back to the point of you can't just say no and be done. If you say God doesn't exist, then you have to come up with an explanation for why everything else happens the way that it does. It's not just a, yes, I don't believe he exists, and then I'm done. I've now then become accountable for a whole nother explanation that has absolutely no way of making sense. And so with all these things, with all the points that we might make, we have to see where these things lead to. And maybe instinctively we don't understand them. Maybe these questions come up in an earnest way, but we have to see where they lead and how they connect to other points. Great point. Other things from these verses? Okay, so let's move on to chapter 9, verse 9. Let's read again this section here, 9 through 20. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asp is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. And so you think back to that outline, that structure that we've had. You've got a question, an answer, and an objection. We've made it through that part. He moves on then in verse 9 to a second question. And so if there was a benefit to the Jews, having first expressed that they're condemned like the other groups, but then said there was a benefit, there was a role and opportunity that they had to play. So if there was this benefit to the Jews, is their position, is their standing, is their status before God better than the rest of people? If because they were entrusted with the oracles of God, is their place or position better than the rest of us? And again, his response emphatically is, no, not at all. No, not at all. It's been made clear already that all are under sin. That's what he says in verse 9. We have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. And that statement, again, helps us summarize what we see in the first two chapters. And by the end of chapter 2, he's already made it clear that all are under sin. All are under sin. So their position is not better. And what then now is his argument to make that point, to elaborate on that even further now? He's shown in the first two chapters from a reasoning perspective and just took a step back and had them think through things. But now in this section in chapter 3, what is he using as his proof of his argument? That the Jews are in no better position than the Gentiles or the rest of the world. Scripture. Exactly. You look at that section there in the second half of 10 through verse 18, and it's a long list of several different references in Scripture. And I've put them up here on the screen, and the reality is you could actually put more on this list. These appear to be the most likely source of the direct quotes, but then there's several others that make a similar point. And in summary, his point here is that even the writings themselves, right? The writings, that the divine words that the Jews were entrusted with, testify to the fact that the Jews themselves are under this condemnation. Let's look at just the first example here in Psalm 14. So in Romans 3, he begins with the statement, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. Look now in Psalm 14. and read the first few verses here. It says, "To the choir master of David, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great terror, and for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad." And so even though this psalm was written presumably in a time of persecution, it makes clear the point that there is none who is good. All are corrupt. And these other passages continue on making that point. In some cases, they make the point, like Psalms 14, that it is all. In some cases, like Isaiah 59, they're probably making the point specifically about the Jews in this description. And so his point is to respond to this, and we won't work through all of these statements. But even the things in which they are entrusted profess and proclaim that they are under sin. The words which they hold dear and boast in and feel an entitlement from are actually words that are teaching that they are condemned as well. Their position is no better than the rest of mankind. And so as he concludes this section then here in verse 19, he points out, after quoting all these things, that the law is speaking to those who are under it. The law is not there to speak to everybody else. The law is speaking to those who are under it. Sometimes we can treat the gospel like it's there for everybody but me, right? We can treat the gospel like it's there for everybody who doesn't believe in God or everybody who has, a different view on this, and miss that it's there for me. The law, not talking specifically about the gospel here, but making that application. When law is given, it speaks to those who are under it. Its own words show that you can't object to this point. Its own words show that there's no way to make the point that the Jews have a special status or position before God, because even the words of that law make that clear. And so therefore, he says, the whole world may be accountable to God. Both the Gentiles, who we saw at the beginning, or whether that's Gentiles or people generally, we see at the beginning those, and then we work through those groups, and his point is all are accountable to God. The Jews who receive the law, the Gentiles who do the things that we see in those chapters, but then if the Jews aren't benefited from the law, what benefit is there to the Gentiles in following the law? There are the points that he's connecting here. So it's speaking to those who are under it. It's making it clear that all are condemned and no one can make an objection to this. And he ends with this point, as if it wasn't clear already. He's making it abundantly clear. And Paul will do this oftentimes, right? You'll see the depth of his argument, and he'll be like, man, I'm really struggling to follow through some of these points. But then he comes back and makes it clear what he's saying very often. Not in every case, but very often he comes back and makes it clear so there's no doubt. And so in verse 20, by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. We've said this already in our studies in Galatians and even here. We have to remember the purpose of the law. The purpose of the law was to do what? To bring about what? Salvation? Justification? Knowledge of sin. The purpose of the law was to bring about knowledge of sin. It was never given as a means for justification. It was never given for justifying or delivering salvation. And so it brings about this knowledge of sin. It helps this people who supposedly are knowing that they need God. Creation testifies of our need for God and the relationship that we should have with God. But law comes along and brings about this knowledge of sin. And we might take that, as you can see on the screen, and connect that to realize that what the law does is it brings about our knowledge of the need for grace and salvation. You ever stopped and thought about how the the Old Testament is broken up from a time perspective? you get one book, Genesis, on everything that happens for thousands of years, right? And in fact, several long periods of time are condensed in a very, very short few chapters, right? Genesis 1 through 11 takes us all the way through the time period up before Abraham. And then you get a little more detail there in Genesis 12 and following, but it still goes high level over 400 plus more years before you get to Exodus. And then the rest of the Old Testament follows that time frame. Why would God give us so little detail about thousands of years, but then give us so much about this period under the law of Moses? Because this period was intended to help even us see of our need for grace and salvation. It was intended to help us see of how sin impacts our lives and of how we need to strive for something, yearn for something, desire for something greater than trying to perform my own salvation through my works. It teaches us, even us, of our need for grace and to be justified by grace through faith. John, and then we'll close.
I just had a thought. It seems like in verse 19, when he talks about the law, he's not simply talking about the law of Moses, but he's also talking about God's law in any form. Just like he talks about back in chapter 2, for the Gentiles, that law of conscience they have, or law of God's moral law. So they all have a law over them, and they're all without excuse, as it said in chapter 1, as well as, all the world may be held accountable, as it says there in verse 19.
Yeah, so Paul's repeated use of law here raises questions about when is he referring to the law of Moses or more generally, right? And those can be tricky questions at times to work through, but many of these points apply even beyond the idea of the Mosaic law. That's right. And so as we see at the end of this section, right, the point's already been made, but just in case we didn't have clarity on it, all are condemned, right? That's how he's ending this section. All are condemned. But thankfully, he's not going to leave us there. Thankfully, there's much more to the story, and that's what we pick up with on Wednesday, Lord willing. So on Wednesday, I want to spend a few more minutes at the beginning of class reflecting back on these first 2.5 chapters and any kind of questions and applications we might draw from that. And then we'll pick up the last few verses here, the last 11 verses in chapter 3, and look at now the hope that comes along from the midst of this condemnation. Thank you.